This podcast is brought to you by Archimed, fast and focused design and manufacturing.
I'm Greg Maurer, founder and owner of Archimed.
And I'm Caroline Squatrigo, talent engagement specialist. We are on a journey to grow, learn, and gain expertise in small to mid-size company culture. Join us. Okay, Greg, who will be joining us today?
Well, Caroline, I think this is a pretty special episode, certainly for me. We're going to be joined by two special guests today. First, my father, Mickey Maurer, and then my daughter, Sophie Maurer. So Mickey is my dad, lifelong Hoosier, and you'll hear more about him as we talk with each other here in a minute. But feel free to Google Mickey Maurer and read about him. It would be a long podcast if I went through all of his achievements here, so I'll leave it at that. Sophie is my eldest child, 13 years old. She has two younger brothers, my son Jonah, age 11, and Eli, age 6. She attends Sycamore School here in Indianapolis, is a 7th grader, loves language arts, loves the debate team. Hopefully she won't use those skills against me today.
I'm hoping she does.
Sophie serves as the Kurt Vonnegut Museum and Library's Free Speech Ambassador. And in that capacity, she's done a number of interviews. So I think probably my favorite has been Louis Black, the comedian. And she also had the honor of introducing Mr. Salman Rushdie at the library's annual fundraiser. So this is old hat for her. She should be great.
Well, I'm excited to listen in. I can't wait.
Well, today is a really exciting day for me. For this podcast. As you know from listening to our podcast, the month of June is a special month, and we're celebrating Fathers and Father's Day. And the way we're doing that is interviewing different associates, Archimed Associates fathers, and talking about culture. And I am very happy to have with us here today my father, Mickey Maurer.
Well, this is a great day for me, too, and I'm honored to be asked, Greg. And I hope I measure up.
Well, I have a few doubts in that regard. Well, Dad, thanks for coming on. Normally when we interview people, we go through a biography, but I'm just going to direct our listeners to Google Mickey Maurer if you want to learn more about Mickey Maurer. If I went through your biography, this would be a very long podcast. Suffice it to say, you're an accomplished entrepreneur, business executive, philanthropist, civic volunteer, and civic leader, and a wonderful father.
Thank you very much for that. I think it's a long biography only because I've lived a long time.
Well, maybe so, but I'm really excited to have you here to talk about our podcast topic of culture. But first, maybe we can start just with a little bit of background.
Sure. Well, I'm trained to be in business. I have an accounting degree from college and a law degree, but I always wanted to be a businessman. My father wanted me to be a lawyer, and since he said he wanted to be a lawyer but he couldn't because it was a Depression era, and he had some brothers and sisters to support. So dutifully, I agreed because I'm the oldest kid, and I said, okay, I'll be the lawyer. And I practiced for 20 years, but gradually went from lawyering to business full time, and I think I'm a better business person than I was a lawyer, and so that's how I ended up in business.
So, what was your first business endeavor? And as I remember, you sort of went piecemeal. You would practice a little bit less law and do a little bit more business until finally you just sort of gave up the practice. So, what was the first business endeavor?
My first job was leading ponies around an amusement area, and fathers and mothers would put their little children on ponies, and I would, along with others, lead the ponies around this little circle. And I was, I think, maybe 8th grade, and the line stopped, and the pony in front of me pooped on my shoe. And I thought, maybe I'll stay in school and get a better job. So that was my first experience in business, but I had lots of jobs. Like most kids, I had a paper route and all that. But when I got in my law practice, that gave me an opportunity to look around and take advantage of opportunities as they arose. And at that time, cable television was pretty hot, and so I got early involvement in cable TV. You might call me a pioneer in that area.
So I remember when cable first was taking off, and it wasn't available in the town we lived in. We lived sort of out in the country, and they hadn't brought cable yet. But I remember that you were putting cable television into a lot of different towns all over the Midwest. And what was that? What was the culture of cable television like then?
Well, remember, these were very small operations, so the number of employees was less than a dozen in most of these areas. So it wasn't appropriate to impose a full culture on these little small areas. So at the time, I wasn't thinking of culture so much as just being a pioneer, just trying to make a living. But later on, in other organizations like newspapers and banking, and when I served as the Secretary of Commerce, we talked a lot about culture. And each culture was a little bit different. I don't think you can apply the same rules to each organization. At Archimed, there's a culture, but that might not be exactly what we would want to emphasize at some of these other businesses I was in.
So maybe you could talk about, you mentioned newspaper, you mentioned banking, there's radio, and then there's the Secretary of Commerce. Those are four businesses essentially that you've owned and or led over your career. Can you talk a little bit about how those cultures differed and maybe illustrate with an example?
Well, the newspaper that we bought was called the Indianapolis Business Journal, and there was a reputation at the time that they were printing things that were innuendos and gossip and half-truths. So we established a culture of accuracy, of pride in the stories that we printed, that there were at least two sources for every story, and not including an internet source. And we would say proudly that our news is accurate and balanced and fair. And that became our culture to be the best newspaper in terms of reliability that we could be. And the bank is a little different because when we established the bank, which is called the National Bank of Indianapolis, incidentally, I wanted to call it Hoosier National Bank, but we had a focus group, and everybody said that was just too hokey, so they turned down my idea. But at the time, there were a lot of out-of-state banks, and the out-of-state banks didn't really care about the local franchise, that Indianapolis area. And so our culture became one of super service. We will provide better service than any other bank in town. That was our culture. The ones that cared about customers the most, we will bend over backwards to do all kinds of things that filled that void that the big banks didn't care to do. And at the IEDC, which is Indiana Economic Development Corporation, in my role as Secretary of Commerce, state government has always had a reputation of being lousy in terms of communication. And we decided that our culture would center around communication. Our reputation would be one that we would not keep people waiting in the waiting rooms. We would return our telephone calls. We would be accessible. We would be open and transparent. We would be everything that government agencies were noted as not being. And I told our folks that we would, if we did that, we'd already be way ahead of any of our government competitors in other states, just by being a good communication and being available for our customers. And it worked out very, very well. In the radio business, it was kind of crazy. In the banking business, it's highly regulated. And that had a lot to do with culture as well. But the radio station's not so regulated. I remember in banking, we all had to have drug tests. And I suggested that to our general manager in the radio business that maybe we ought to drug test our disc jockeys, our on-air personalities. And my manager there said, well, we could do that, but then we'd lose them all. So
Yeah.
It's a different culture.
Yeah, it seems like when you decided to develop these cultures that you identified where the market was being let down, and you identified ways to address those unmet needs, and you did it in part through the development of culture that would focus on those important areas.
Yeah, I think that's right. It sort of developed, it sort of was apparent almost right away what direction we should go to and what our culture should be centered around. And it was different for each business. And it wasn't always so easy. In the newspaper business, we had to stand up for our culture. We had to take risks and remind people how important our culture was at the newspaper in terms of accuracy and fair stories.
So you have some oftentimes you have conflict in journalism, right, between the advertisers and the editorial, or the advertisers and the news?
We had a young reporter at our newspaper was doing a story about the local supermarket. At the time it was called Marsh, but they're out of business now, so I guess I can mention them by name.
Too late now.
And Mr. Marsh, his name was Don, was a good community citizen, but he was not a very good operator. And according to our story, the theory was that he hadn't been quite as kind to his shareholders as he was to the community. And Don Marsh was not pleased with how the article was developing. He was a large advertiser at the newspaper, and he also spent over $250,000 a year with us at the radio stations. He was also a banking customer, and he's also selling a lot of business journals at his stores every weekend at a nice clip. So he demanded that we pull the story, or make it a very flattering story. And if we didn't, he was going to pull all the advertising, kick us out of his grocery stores, supermarkets, and he also owned some stock in the bank he threatened to sell, which wasn't that big of a deal, but a lot of threats. And we ran the story across the top of the journal's front page. And we never did, and we never would let anyone dictate to us, our newsroom, what they write. That was part of our culture of pride and accuracy and fairness and independence. So he did pull all the business, and for a long, long time. And that was one way that we drove home to our employees that we really care about the culture and that we will defend the culture no matter what the price. So that was a good opportunity for us to say, this is important. The culture of this newspaper is important. Later on, we got an award called the Friend of the First Amendment Award, demonstrating freedom of the press. We got it from the Indianapolis Professional Chapter of the Society for Professional Journalists. Big, long name, but a pretty nice group, and I believe we deserved the award. And it was an opportunity for us to let everybody know, not our customers, our employees, and everybody else, what our culture was and what kind of newspaper we were. So that's an example of how we defended our culture.
Yeah, a few weeks back we had a episode, the topic of which was the cost of an ethical culture, and we talked with Phil Kinney about his approach at Wilhelm, and one of the things that he mentioned was that there was a short-term cost to an ethical culture, but the long-term return more than paid for that short-term cost. Even the soft return of employee morale and of making you as business people feel better and sleeping well at night was enough of a return. But so that sounded like a pretty big short-term cost. Did you ever make up for it in the longer term, and if so, how?
Well, no, I think the money that we didn't get over the course of the year or two that we didn't get all that advertising, we lost. However, eventually the supermarkets began to advertise again, sensing, I hope, that we were a pretty good, efficient buy for them, and it was in their best interest. But it didn't really make much difference to us. The more important thing was we did what we should have done.
Yeah. So one of the things I'm learning from your description of the various cultures is there's no one right culture. There's a right culture for any particular business, but that culture might be very wrong for another business.
Yeah, I think that's right. Maybe not wrong, but maybe not a good exact fit.
Yeah.
I think that I describe the culture for these organizations very narrowly because there's a lot more to culture than just these narrow items. But I think that businesses will show you that as part of a general culture, there's areas that you should concentrate on, and that depends on the business.
And so if you think about, you mentioned banking, highly regulated, a very formal culture. I know it's a suit and tie culture. And then you mentioned radio, where you couldn't staff your radio business if you had drug tests, and it's less regulated. Did you ever have some sort of experience where you could really see the difference between those two cultures?
Of course. In the early days when the bank was beginning, we didn't have a lot of people, maybe a couple of dozen. Now we have many hundreds of employees. So we combined our holiday party, bank with radio station. And as you say, the bankers all showed up in suits and ties. And of course the radio station didn't. One of our bankers went through the front door of this venue where we're having a joint party, and a radio station man came up and took a scissors and cut his tie off. And that showed pretty quickly that there were two different cultures that were clashing at that time.
Yeah, I'd love to see. You should frame that cut off tie and put it up. And so, is there an aspect of culture that you think is somewhat universal that you'd like to see in all the companies you touch?
Well, of course, I think we have to foster honesty, dependability, and I won't name all those wonderful adjectives, but everybody knows what they are. And when we interview, those are the kind of things that we want to look for, and we make sure that the prospective employee fits the culture, but fits it in such a way as that the basics are there. And it's more than just intelligence. Culture has something to do with collegiality, and does this prospective employee fit the culture? And those are the times when you look at maybe the broader aspects to a culture rather than the narrow ones I described.
I have personal attributes that may or may not fit within a culture in which I work. So I think you and I are both more entrepreneurial than we are structured in the way we might approach business, taking risks and things like that. And then I think about the bank, and the banking industry is set up to moderate the amount of risk that a bank takes. So do you find that there's a a sort of a yin and yang or strain there?
No. I think that's compatible. I think there's room in a bureaucracy for an entrepreneur. We might call it intrapreneurial. And I think a smart organization like Archimed would be one that would encourage entrepreneurial vision within the organization. And I've called that intrapreneurial. And I think there should be room for that in the culture of every organization, no matter whether it's in the early stage or in a big company stage.
So we hopefully by now in June we have listeners. This is a startup podcast, so it's new this year, and I want to make sure that I give you the opportunity to share advice or lessons learned for our listeners beyond what you've shared already.
Okay, well, I think first of all, I don't impart advice particularly to my kids unless they ask for it. I had endeavored to do that, but one of your siblings told me after I gave some advice, said, "Hey, Dad, we just don't do it that way anymore." So I stopped giving advice to kids, my children, unless they ask specific questions. But you did ask, so I would say here's something to think about. Always play by your rules in terms of your ethics and strive to be at the highest standard, regardless of the ethics of the people with whom you are dealing. To give you an example of that, suppose you're trying to reach somebody and that person just doesn't return your call. I see that as an ethical flaw, bad manners, or you can describe it any way you want. Now, let's say that person you tried to reach didn't return your call, and one day they called you. Do you not return their call because they didn't treat you very well in the first place? Or do you play by your own rules, which are, I'll return all my calls? So here's an opportunity for you to play at the highest standards regardless of whom you're dealing with. And sometimes that's difficult. And that's just one simple example. But remember, it doesn't make much difference who you're dealing with and the ethics they have. It's your ethics and your attitude toward business that's much more important. So I would recommend that, and it's harder. I mean, when you're subjected to a higher standard, you have to work a little harder or be a little smarter to win the game of business if you're playing against somebody that doesn't play by your rules, but do it anyway. And that would be the advice I would give.
Yeah, I was just thinking about how it might be a competitive advantage to have, a lower standard of ethics. And we talked about this in an earlier episode of our podcast about how that you could satisfy the ethical standard of Harvard Business School or what have you, all the ethical business ethics teachers in all the Ivy League schools, but still be below your standard. And it would be a competitive advantage if you only adhered to that lower standard. But your advice is bite the bullet and find a way to make up for that competitive difference in some other way.
Well, it's a sense of pride. You might say to yourself, I'm a little bit smarter than the guy I'm working with, so I can still win the game and play it at the highest level.
So just thinking about this, are there people in your life where they played at a little lower ethical standard, not to say they were unethical, but a lower standard, and they were plenty smart, and you thought, man, the way that deck is stacked, it's going to be so hard I might pass on this deal?
Of course, I've done that before. There's a couple of people that I just won't engage because either their ethical standards are so low or that they're low enough that I don't want to play in that arena. Remember, your reputation is about the most important asset you have, and that's good advice too. Protect your reputation, and your reputation is affected by those with whom you are dealing. That's your contemporaries, your employees, your even customers have a lot to do with how you're perceived in your industry and as a person. And so I'd be careful with whom I associate in that regard.
Yeah, that's really good advice, and that isn't limited to business, I suppose, because I remember getting that advice growing up. I don't know whether it was unsolicited or not. And for the record, don't wait for me to ask you for advice. Just keep it coming. I appreciate it.
Well, I think you've just about drained me dry. I don't know that I have any more advice to give you today, but I appreciate that.
So this was a lot of fun, and I don't know whether I personally learned a lot because I feel as a kid growing up at the dinner table, you would subtly infuse this advice into the conversation as you heard the travails of our day. And I remember even small things like making sure that if they mistakenly thought you were 12 instead of 13, and they sold you the $12 ticket at the movies, that you would march us back up there and make sure we paid for the difference. Little things like that. I've never seen you sacrifice your ethical standard for any reason whatsoever, and I think that's been a guiding light for me personally and in business, and I very much appreciate it.
That's very nice of you to say, and I will add that the tables are turning and have turned, I guess, because the lessons that I perhaps imparted to you when you were younger, you are paying me back because I'm learning so much from you as how you do business here at Archimed, and I'm so pleased to note that that business is being operated at a highest standard, and so it's great for me to be involved and to learn a little bit from you.
Well, gosh, I'm flattered by that, and I'll treasure those words. And thanks, Dad, for coming on. I really had fun doing this, and thanks also for your support throughout my life and all of my endeavors, including at Archimed.
Well, it's an honor to be here, and thank you for that invitation and this time with you.
Well, that was a blast for me. Not many people have an opportunity to interview their own dad, and I'm very thankful for this. I'm also thankful to be interviewed by my daughter, Sophie. So here we go. Well, now the tables have turned. I am going to be interviewed by someone very special to me, my 13-year-old daughter, Sophie. Sophie's with us today as part of our Father's Day podcast episodes. Sophie, thank you for coming onto the podcast and for interviewing me today.
Thank you for having me.
So what do you want to talk about?
Well, I was thinking that we could talk about the business culture and how that can tie into parenting and also play out in the workforce. So, do you have any advice for young individuals wanting to start a healthy and successful business?
Yeah, absolutely I do. First, I would say that the biggest hurdle is just to give it a shot. It takes a lot of courage to leave a very safe, at least relatively safe employment environment. You have the safety of a job, and you have to leave that and go out on your own. So it takes a lot of courage to do that. And I would counsel anyone interested in that to find that courage and give it a shot. And also to find good people to work with. I've been blessed to have supportive partners, including my business partners at Archimed, Kevin and John. I also have a ton of support at home. So when I work late, work in the evenings, I have the support of you and your brothers and your mom, and that means a lot. But before you give it a shot, one of the things that helps folks who are becoming entrepreneurs is to learn as much as you can on somebody else's dime. So try and get jobs working with and for other people who can be mentors and advisors to you. Pursue a wide variety of different experiences, and just learn as much as you can, and then give it a shot.
So whenever you have an idea, I think you need a backup plan. And what happens if that plan is not good and it's as good as it can get, but it's still not good? And what happens if that plan fails?
Right. That's a thoughtful question, because when you become an entrepreneur, failure is a distinct possibility. And in fact, one might suggest that failure is inevitable. You don't know when you're going to fail, but if you keep playing the game, engaging in the arena, eventually you'll experience failure. So my backup plan has always been my education. I went out and got a lot of education, a double major in college and a law degree. And so I always had a trade I could ply if failures in entrepreneurship and business were too much and I needed to make a living to provide for my family. So that was my backup plan. But in reality, there is this necessity to engage in the arena, the entrepreneurship arena, and have some comfort that your backup plan isn't so great. That's part of the risk. That's part of the risk profile of entrepreneurship.
So sometimes as an owner, you can tell when something is amiss or not going well. And do you ever let it play out in order to allow for people to learn from it? Or do you step in and try to stop it? And do you take the same approach to this at home as you do at work?
Well, so that's a two-part question. You're probably better able to answer that second part than I am, since you see it at home. You're talking culturally, I think, not operationally. In other words, if I think somebody's about to make a bad part and ship it, I would not let that happen just so they could learn from it. So culturally, it's not a cut and dry answer. You don't want to reach down and micromanage people, at least in my approach to business, and part of the Archimed philosophy is you want to empower people to do the job you've asked them to do, but not necessarily tell them how to do it for a variety of reasons. One, because they'll suffocate under that micromanagement. Two, because they're the experts. You hired them because they know more about that particular area than you do. So I want them to take ownership in their jobs and their duties. I want them to make decisions. And in order for that to happen, I need to, while giving them guidance, give them the room to fail or even to find another way to do it that I hadn't thought of. And I think that the more expensive the failure, the more I'll try to convince them on the merits to listen to me. And every once in a while, when the cost of potential failure is too high, I may step in and make a decision contrary to the decision that one of the employees was about to make. That's pretty rare. I can think of only a couple times I've done that in my career. So yeah, that's my approach.
I think at home what you do is, you always remind us, do you have everything ready for the next day? Is your homework done? Is your lunch packed? Do you need help with your homework? Do you need help with your lunch? And I remember a few times when I was younger, I would forget things. And you would never bring them to school for me. And I remember getting so frustrated because everyone else's dad seemed to bring their lunch or bring their water, and you never brought it. And then finally, as I'm getting older, I'm not forgetting things. I did forget my math binder yesterday and left it at home. But I find that I'm forgetting things a lot less because of that. So I think you do let things play out. You remind us, and then if you see, her lunch isn't packed, I'm not going to remind her again,
Yeah, I think that it's important in parenting to allow your children to experience the consequences of their actions so that they can learn from that. I'm not here to make sure you have lunch. That's not my job. My larger job, obviously, is to make sure that you evolve into a high functioning adult who knows how to make decisions and has good judgment and is thoughtful and caring and all those things. And if I keep saving you, I remember one time I saw your binder before you left, and I kept saying, "Do you have everything?" I even said, "Do you have everything for math class?" Hoping you would think about it, but you didn't. And the idea there is that eventually you're going to think about all the things you need and prepare because you realize the consequences are too unpleasant to not give it that effort.
Yeah. Is it ever hard in the workforce to be able to make a decision that's not popular that many other people you're around may be making for their business and what's best for them, or maybe what's not best for them? I know that as a parent, you make rules that's best for me, and no matter how much I tell you how frustrated I am with it, you say, no, you're still grounded. You made a mistake. Or, just because everyone else has social media doesn't mean you get it. So is that ever something that occurs in the workforce?
So, yeah, an interesting question. I'm going to phrase it a little differently. I don't have a courage problem. So when I know what the right thing is to do, I'll do it. And there's nothing that's going to put me off from that path. There's no pressure out there that can prevent me from making the right decision. In business, the hard part is figuring out what the right decision is. And to relate to parenting, because that's what you're asking me, one of the things about social media is it plugs you into your friend group and keeps you connected. And so I wasn't always sure what the right decision was. It took me a while to figure it out. Do I give social media to someone who at the time was 11 years old when you were first asking about it so that she can have strong connections? That's how people communicate. That's how young people communicate. And then on the other side is, do I restrict social media to avoid the ills and understand that a young child isn't mature enough to handle social media necessarily in a responsible way? So the hard part was to research and think and come to a conclusion about what the right answer was. But once that happens, I've never had a hard time sticking to it.
Mm-hmm. So screwing up culture has long-term consequences. Because one, it's hard to, once you are in a place where you messed up, it can be hard to get back to the place you were before, where everything was going great and things were moving right along. And how does parenting relate to this? And can you think of an example when you made a parenting mistake? I can. How about in the workforce as well?
Okay, so that's an interesting. So have you've listened to some podcast episodes, and we covered that topic about how difficult it is to change a bad culture and evolve into a good, healthy culture. And then it's much easier to maintain a healthy culture than it is to let it disintegrate and try and save it. So that's one thing: is stay on top of it. Don't be complacent. And but we all make mistakes, and so I can think of examples in the workforce where I've made mistakes. What do I do about it? Is really the thing that sets one apart from another. I try and atone for those mistakes. I apologize. I don't ever ignore something that, if I've said something that might have been hurtful, I try and address it and apologize. I try and be supportive, and I try and do my duty. I have a responsibility to my employees, and I try and fulfill that responsibility day in and day out, but I don't always get it right. So what I ask from my employees is a little grace, that I am not perfect, that I make mistakes, that I'm a human, and I won't ever stop making mistakes. Hopefully I won't make the same ones, but I hope that they give me a little latitude with that understanding that I do make mistakes. So, and I can certainly think of parenting fails. You can too. I know which one comes to my mind. What comes to your mind?
I would say you have done a lot of things right. I know when people ask me, what do you think of your parents? I say, I think they're amazing. I don't even know if I can be like you and Mom are when I have kids. But I would say...
I'm so happy we're recording this so I can play this back to you.
But, no, I actually do mean it. But I can think of one or two mistakes that stick out and that I remember. I'm going to share one. If you'd like to share the other, you can. But we were in the car, and I was 3 years old, and I had a cookie. And my dad said, okay, if you're good at the end of the car ride, you can have this cookie. So he puts it on the dashboard, and of course I'm 3 and I throw a fit, and then I stop crying and I say, can I still have the cookie? And he grabs it off of the dashboard, crumples it up, throws it in his mouth, and goes, this cookie, you want this cookie. Crumbs are flying everywhere. We're on the highway. I'm crying again. And I just remember that, not vividly, But from when I hear this, I'm like, oh gosh. Like
Well, we tell the story a lot.
yeah.
So you've
I
heard
mean,
it. You've heard it, even if you don't remember it. You've heard it so many times. Yeah, that was not my best parenting moment, and it looks sort of like the Cookie Monster. Have you ever seen the Cookie Monster eat cookies on Sesame Street? You know, the gobbling it up and crumbs are flying everywhere. That's what it looked like. I said, you don't get a cookie for throwing a fit, and in retrospect, I was the one throwing the fit, and so yeah, that's a good story. Um, and I learned from it. And the other sort of parenting issue is patience. It's something I work on all the time. I know you just glanced at the Shalom in the Home paper, didn't you? Is that
yes.
what you did? So
Yes.
patience and this idea of Shalom in the home, which is peace in the home, and it's a virtue as a parent to create peace in your home. And it's not necessarily easy or natural. It has to be top of mind. It has to be something you think about as a goal. Otherwise, the stress of life will get to you, and before long, there won't be any peace in your home. So that's something that I think I've made good improvement over the years. Would you give me a good grade for improvement
Yes. Probably like a 7,
out of 8?
10.
Okay, so that's one of the things I'm working on is also there's other aspects of being a good leader and how they overlap with being a good parent. I would say continually improving yourself, which is what we talked about. Actively listening. So when you come in and want to talk to me, I don't stare at my computer or phone, even though in the past that might have been something I would have thought was okay. I close my computer, I put it
That's what I
aside.
do
Well,
when
you
you
need
come
to
in.
actively listen. Otherwise,
Yeah.
you're showing the other person that you really don't care what they're saying.
Yeah.
And then to collaborate. So I in conversations with you about topics, I am open-minded that I may not have the right answer, that you might have the right answer, that you might have something of great value to contribute. So that collaboration is important in the workplace and at home.
So, this question is not something I had planned on asking you, but it just came to mind. Do you ever, I know that sometimes you tell me this all the time and you're super proud of it, how you know when we do something wrong and you don't tell us. And you're like, you just have this way of bringing things up. And it's good, it's funny. And you're like, yeah, what'd you do last night? I remember I had a friend over and I had this great idea to open my bedroom window and sit on my roof. And I wasn't planning on telling you. And then you said, so what'd you guys do? We're like, oh, nothing. And then you said, you look a little windblown. And you have this way of not directly, but letting me know you know what I'm doing when you don't always tell me what I'm doing wrong. And do you ever have this in the workforce where you see something is not going well or something is happening that you're not aware of? Do you always mention it or do you just let it be?
Well, that's an interesting question. So at home, I notice things because I'm the dad, and you're a bright young lady, but I'm still ahead of you enough to catch things that you think maybe I won't catch.
Can you give any examples?
No, not for public consumption, but rest assured, you're going to get away with very little if my eyes are open. At work, I don't quite approach it the same way. We have open, transparent, timely communication. And so I think it's at work, at least, if somebody's struggling or making a mistake, it's not helpful to overlook it. I think it's the healthy approach is to have open, honest, transparent conversations. There's not a lot of judgment involved in those conversations, or there's not trouble, consequences, like there would be at home for mistakes. I think the open communication is very vitally important at work. So I take that kind of approach at work, which might be a little bit different than at home.
What's your favorite memory that you have being a father? I think it's a really hard job, and I think you seem to do it very well, but you're welcome. What's your favorite where you knew that, wow, this is, this is my family. I'm happy I had kids. What's one of those moments you had where you really just felt, because I have moments where I'm like, wow, I love my class and at school. They're amazing. And I have moments where I'm like, oh my God, can you stop humming? And it just moments I get frustrated, and moments I love everybody in my grade. And today, as I was driving home from school, I was thinking like, wow, I feel so grateful for everybody I get to know, like my family, my friends. And do you ever have that moment with your kids?
All the time. And what you're describing is the difference between being fulfilled, which is another podcast episode. We talked about happiness versus fulfillment. And in parenting, you're not always going to be happy. Parenting comes with frustration and exhaustion and perhaps anger and all sorts of emotions that no one would associate with happiness. But the longer road is a road towards fulfillment, where you're making an impact on the world by adding individuals, creating an environment for those individuals to flourish and reach their potential and apply themselves in a productive, moral, ethical way to improve society and make a difference. And that is incredibly fulfilling. And even the arc of that progress, since you're still being raised in the house, the arc of that progress is fulfilling. And I can think of many examples. The first one was when we heard about the terrible tornadoes a decade ago or so in Henryville on the radio. And Mom and I said, well, isn't that horrible? Gosh, too bad for Henryville. And you in the back seat at 3, 4, or 5 said, well, that's all you're going to do is talk about it. And you marshaled us to action. And before long, we were delivering a check to the Salvation Army that was heading down to Henryville to provide relief. So that was one of those proud moments. And at work, also as a business owner, it's definitely more fulfillment. There's frustrations and setbacks, and you have to have grit and determination to overcome those things and reach fulfillment. Ideally, at home and at work, there are more happy moments than unhappy moments. But fulfillment's really the goal that you're after in both situations.
Do you ever get burnt out? I know that, sometimes if you go to school, if you go to work, college, high school, there's always going to be times where you feel stressed out or you feel like you need a spring break. So do you ever feel that way? I know that I see you work really hard. We go on spring break and you still work. You work on Sundays. You work, you don't drop me off at camp. You are working. And I really it sets a good example for me. And how do you combat being burnt out?
Right. Well, so I hope I don't work so much that later on in life you look back and you say, my dad was always working.
No, I didn't mean it that way.
Go ahead.
You're here all the time. Not all the time, but, you make an effort to be here for family dinners and to spend time with me at night or to read a book with me. I feel like we just did something together recently.
Lunch.
Oh my gosh, lunch. Yesterday, my dad picked me up from school, and I missed about 15 minutes of choir, and we went home, and he ordered the best fried.
You had fried chicken sandwich.
Fried chicken sandwich, and we just
Joella's.
sat and talked. Joella's, and just sat and talked. And you always make sure you have, and you spend quality time with your kids. Even if we don't ask, you ask, which is nice.
So, I appreciate that feedback. It's good to hear. I have more work than I can get done in a normal work day. So I try and get it done when I'm not missed, late at night or on a Sunday when you're engaged in your own activities. But I try and be home for dinner every night, and obviously I'm home early on Fridays and don't work. Spend time with the family through Friday night and through Saturday. So there's that. And then I try and take some time for myself. So exercise has been a help for me. Even though I don't feel like exercising necessarily in the morning, once you guys leave for school, I go downstairs and get exercise, and it does make me feel better and helps me find a way to tampen out that burned out feeling. And if I'm getting pulled in too many different directions, I might look at all the things I'm doing and the activities and volunteer activities. I might have to say no to things that I like, things that are valuable to me, but that I can't do it. I can't do it all. I can't, I do feel sometimes I'm pulled in many different directions with various business efforts, philanthropic efforts, family efforts, and things that I want to do for myself. But I just try and balance that. That's what success looks like. To have the blessings of a full life and all those opportunities. It's just the trick is to manage it in a way where you don't get burned out. And it's more like a pendulum. You don't ever say, okay, well, I solved that burned out problem. It swings. You go from, wow, I'm really feeling burned out, I need to scale back, to, okay, I'm ready to apply myself in a new philanthropic endeavor. And then it sort of swings a little bit. But to sum it up, I'd say you got to eat well, exercise, read, spend time with your family and friends, find a hobby. As my dad told me, balance. Find balance in life. He said something like, balance, my boy, balance.
Yeah. When you say eat well, you really mean it. If you walked into our kitchen, you open the fridge, you would see rye bread, almond butter. I asked you to buy milk chocolate chips, and you were like, I don't know, let's stick to dark chocolate chips.
I like dark chocolate, so.
Or like paleo pancakes, and the Lily's ice cream, her sugar-free ice cream he eats.
Well, I buy you Grater, so I think you're in good shape.
Yeah.
Well, you have to. It takes discipline to do the things that are good for you, and what's good for me may be different. Maybe in your life you'll make different choices, and that's fine. I think you should fashion a life that's right for you, which may not be the one I fasten for myself. But you asked about parenting moments. Well, I'll add this moment to the list. I'm incredibly proud of you, Sophie, and of what you've grown into as a young woman, and the contributions you make in your volunteer activities, and the poise and maturity that you've shown at 13 years old to interview your old man for this podcast. So I wanted to say that I love you, I admire you, and thank you for doing this today.
Thank you. I would like to share, very glad that we have a close relationship and that I get to talk to you about things that if I had to describe a dad, I would describe exactly you. Like, I feel like I'm going to cry, but I would describe probably exactly you.
That's so sweet. Love you, Soph.
I love you.
That was fun. Sophie's a character, and she did write all her own interview questions, and I'm very proud of that. I wanted to make sure the listeners knew that. She really put her stamp on it. I know I'm biased, but she's a special kid, and I just really love that interview.
No, I think it's clear Sophie's going on to some pretty big and grand things in her life. I'm excited to see where her journey takes her.
Well, starting with interviewing me, she can only go up from there, that's for sure. So, Caroline, what did you learn today?
Well, to start off with Mickey, he's done a lot. I think that's really clear. And I found it interesting. He started with cable, and he went from cable, where culture was, an afterthought, if at all the way through being Secretary of Commerce for the state of Indiana, where culture was paramount. So he's kind of seen the whole spectrum of things.
Yeah, I think when he got involved in various endeavors, he was thoughtful and proactive in determining, what industry are we getting into, and what's the business culture there, and what does it lack? So identifying specifically the culture of this industry, and it's falling short here, and then they would focus on those areas to set themselves apart. Like, for example, in state government, he identified that a state government that communicated really, really well would set themselves apart from all the other state governments. Or in media, adhering to the highest journalistic standards when he got involved at the IBJ would also set him apart.
Well, and he also, he really thought about the industry that he was in and the differences in culture depending where you were. So he didn't have a blanket approach to culture, which I think is kind of one of the keys to his success. One example we can talk about is drug tests. They were kind of a staple in banking, and he thought about introducing them into radio and realized very quickly they might not have anyone working there. And so, he pivoted and kind of honored that difference in culture.
Yeah, that was a fun exchange between the general manager and Mickey about drug tests. Sure, we can do it, but no one's going to be here tomorrow to be on the radio. And also back to the key of ethics and culture, which I think is one of the commonalities really across all of his endeavors. All of his endeavors had ethics as part of their culture, and it was highlighted by that Marsh supermarket story. And I really enjoyed that story. Mickey also mentioned that when interacting with other people and doing business with other people, there's some folks whose standards might fall above the basic business ethical standard, but fall below his standard. And he counseled us to maintain our standards and not let them fall to meet somebody else's.
Yeah, I think that's a very key point, and it certainly takes some guts to do some stuff like that. And Mickey talked about when he printed the article about Marsh, they took a sizable hit, and he really had no thought other than, well, we are going to print this because this is what's happening. And there was not, he knew that there might be some financial hit in the short term, but he saw the vision of the importance of that integrity and keeping that in their focus.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm very proud of that. The example of a guiding light as we operate our business. One of my favorite stories Mickey told was about and I can just picture this so clearly, the holiday party that was at the Vogue, and he combined the bank holiday party with the radio station holiday party, and they had drastically different cultures. The industries had different cultures, the companies had different cultures, and so the radio station guys are starting early and drinking in preparation for the party, and the first set of bankers walk into the Vogue with their suits and their ties, and one of the drunk radio employees walked up to a banker with a pair of scissors and cut off his tie. I just chuckled when he told that story. I love it.
I like that they thought it would be a good idea to get the two groups together in the first place. They just thought we could throw them in a room together and it'd be fine.
Yeah, I know a lot of Mickey's former radio employees, and so when he told that story, I could think of at least a dozen former radio employees that would have picked up that pair of scissors and cut that tie off for sure.
I really liked Mickey's idea and concept of entrepreneurship, and I think it's a concept that should be and is a part of Archimed's culture. And in fact, I think this podcast kind of illustrates that pretty well. It's not within our realm of manufacturing, so I think this is a pretty good example of that.
Yeah, it's creative thinking, and we stood up a new effort here, not knowing a whole lot about it. And I think, personally, as one of his kids, Mickey has always encouraged me to take calculated risk. Give it a shot, work hard, be honest, and he's always walked that walk.
Well, I think, we've got to talk about Sophie. Greg, do you think our hosting jobs are in danger here?
Yeah, she's pretty good, Caroline. I think we have to watch our back. She may take our podcast jobs if we're not careful.
Yeah. I liked your discussion on burnout and work-life balance, but your story about the cookie is particularly funny.
Yeah, not my best parenting moment, but, we tell that story around the house and we laugh about it now. And as a parent and as a leader in business, I think it's important to be human and acknowledge mistakes and learn from them, and hopefully receive a little bit of grace from your kids in this instance, or from your colleagues at work when you make those mistakes. We're not, as parents and as leaders, not perfect, and we certainly don't have all the answers. So at home, we keep telling that story because we like to laugh about it, but also I think it acknowledges that as a parent and as a leader, I'm not perfect. I'm human. I make mistakes.
Yeah, I think, we all do. So it's like you said, a good story to illustrate that lesson. This was fun. I think it was nice to have the two-parter. We got multiple generations into one podcast, and I think we learned a lot.
Yeah, and I enjoyed this month very much. This special June Father's Day session, a series of episodes were really fun to listen to and record. And I hope that all the fathers out there are also enjoying these episodes and enjoying Father's Day. And we look forward to returning to the usual course of action in July. See you then.
On our next episode, we will discuss some tools that can help us successfully manage culture. We will be joined by Marcy Bandick from the Strategy Forums and Mike Elliott from Advisa. See you then.